Hi everyone, I'm Keith Hocton. As you can probably hear from my voice, I have the most awful cold, so I apologize for my voice in advance. But there's a story that I have to tell you. I'm in the UK, and I've been researching this story for a fair time now, so cold or no, here we go. Ever since the 1870s, rumours have swirled around the relationship between Queen Victoria and her Highland servant, John Brown. Was it friendship or something a little bit more dangerous? One of them in love? Perhaps both. Could they even have married in secret? And the most tantalizing whisper of all, might they have had a child together? Historian Fern Riddle has been investigating these claims in her new book, Victoria's Secret. I absolutely love it, by the way. And she's uncovered dramatic new evidence that changes how we see not only John Brown, but Victoria herself. Now, most of us think we know this story. I certainly did. I thought I knew the story. You know, the widowed queen, devastated by Albert's death, turns to the companionship of a strapping Highland gillie. The image is familiar. Victoria dressed in black, her eyes heavy with grief, leaning on this blunt, loyal Scot who actually stayed by her side for over 2 decades. And the official line has always been that he was just a servant, maybe even a good friend. But was that really all? For Riddle, the questions are sharper. You know, were they lovers? Did they secretly marry? And I think almost unthinkable for the monarchy at the time, probably even now, was there a child? And she says in her book that she wasn't drawn to the story because of the royal trappings. In fact, she says herself, I don't do royals. Her interest has always been in the history from below. You know, the forgotten stories, the stories that I love, the stories of ordinary people. And John Brown, you know, the Queen's constant companion for 20 years, is oddly absent from the grand narratives of Victoria's reign. You just don't find him. And we almost know nothing about him, apart from the caricatures and the whispers. Riddle's research began with an overlooked book from 1969, Empress Brown by Tom Cullen. And in it, she stumbled across facsimiles of letters between Victoria and John Brown. Genuine, intimate letters, tucked away, almost forgotten. How had she never seen them before? And why weren't historians talking about them now? The answer, I think, is as mysterious as the letters themselves. You know, after Cullen, no one could trace the originals. They just disappeared. And some scholars actually doubted that they were even real. But Cullen's acknowledgements dropped tantalizing hints that Brown's family had actually kept a very secret archive, a cache of papers passed down quietly from family to family, never shown, never spoken of, yet persistent in rumor. For Riddle, I think that was just the spark. A secret archive hidden for over a century, just waiting to be found. And so she set out to track it down, and this is where this story begins. You know, these days when I'm working on a story like this, and I presume Riddle did the same, you know, digitized archives are absolutely fundamental. You know, places like Ancestry and Find My Past, and of course Scotland's People, have become absolute treasure troves. Whole family histories, marriages, deaths, census records, all at your fingertips. So when Riddle saw hints that John Brown's family might have guarded a secret archive, the first thing she did was trace his entire family tree. Brothers, wives, children, cousins, uncles, all of it. And that trail took her somewhere she didn't expect, across the Atlantic to Minnesota, because it was there that she found John's only surviving relatives, descendants of his brother Hugh. Now, Hugh himself had been close to Victoria, stepping into John's role after his death, and it was Hugh's descendants in America who had kept something hidden. For 160 years, they protected it, a secret family archive, and what they didn't expect was a British historian sliding into their Facebook inbox asking to talk about their ancestor. But that's what she did. And what happened next was absolutely extraordinary. I'll leave that hanging for a moment, the archive and the revelations it holds, because before we dive into those discoveries, it's worth stepping back and looking at the relationship itself on the surface. Just how unusual was it for a monarch to form a bond with a servant? And who exactly was John Brown in the public eye? John actually began his career as a gillie at Balmoral, the Scottish retreat that Victoria and Albert had claimed for themselves. Albert thought the Highlands were the closest he could actually get to his beloved Coburg, and John was already in service there when the royal couple arrived. Albert admired him, he trusted him, and he appointed him as Victoria's personal servant, out of doors. And what that meant was that whenever Albert went hunting or shooting, John was there, riding beside the Queen, leading her pony on foot, keeping her safe, tending to the children. He was dependable, he was blunt, and he was utterly reliable. Even then, Victoria admitted that she was irresistibly drawn to him. He anticipated her every need, which in royal service was the highest mark of distinction. But at that stage, he was simply a Balmoral servant, present only in the Highlands. And of course, then everything changed after Albert's death. 3 years into widowhood, Victoria was still paralyzed by grief, sunk in a suicidal depression. Her doctors and her family urged her to get fresh air, and the man they trusted to lead her pony, to steady her, and to protect her was John Brown. So he suddenly moves from the periphery of her life to the very center. And over the next 20 years, I think he became much more than a servant. The rumors began almost immediately. By the mid-1860s, barely 2 years after he followed her to Osborne and then London, whispers of Mrs. Brown were already everywhere. Her own daughters joked about him being Mama's lover. The court was absolutely scandalized. Society was aghast. After all, Victoria was a queen, a widow still draped in black, and John was the son of a crofter, a servant. For intimacy, even the suggestion of it to exist between them was completely shocking. And yet, they were absolutely inseparable. She devoted herself to him, and he to her. The gossip of a secret marriage, even of a child, caught fire because, as in all rumors, there had to be at least a spark behind the smoke. It then became very clear and very quickly to everyone around Victoria that her relationship with John was not a simple matter of monarch and servant. There were always hints, whispers that something deeper might have been going on. And when Riddle set out to investigate, she had no idea of the sheer scale of evidence that she would uncover. A mountain of it, really, more than she had ever expected. Some of it connects back to what we already knew or thought we knew. You know, you take Bendor Grosvenor's discovery in the early 2000s. There's a remarkable letter in Victoria's own handwriting written after John's death, where she actually confessed that this was the second time that she had suffered such terrible grief. The first, of course, was Albert. That alone tells us something profound about the place of John Brown in her life. Then there are the diary entries of politicians, courtiers, and others at the time. Fragments published since the 1950s, full of tantalizing rumors, half-told stories, and strange little hints about John and Victoria. What Riddle did, which I thought was brilliant, was to take all of that and place it in its proper context, testing those so-called myths and fresh discoveries. And what she found led her to a very different picture of Victoria, a picture grounded not in gossip, but actually in evidence. And I think the great turning point in this journey was the pursuit of the John Brown family archive, because for decades it was just whispered about, a secret collection of letters, of documents, of keepsakes, guarded fiercely by Brown's descendants. A handful of historians hinted at having seen it, but they were sworn to secrecy, never revealing its location or its contents. And for most scholars, that was actually enough to dismiss it as rumor. After all, history depends on evidence that we can actually see, evidence that we can actually test and verify. And without that, what are we left with but hearsay? But Riddle wanted to know whether Tom Cullen's facsimiles, printed back in Empress Brown in 1969, were actually genuine. And her first breakthrough was discovering that they were. Those letters actually existed, sitting quietly in an archive in Aberdeen. No one had realized. And then she found something absolutely astonishing, what she now calls the last letters of Queen Victoria. They were written to John Brown's sister-in-law after his death. Letters where Victoria confessed that no one had loved him more than she did, where she recalled the words that they had once said to one another. And I'll quote directly from her book, "No one loves you more than I do." I mean, this is raw, intimate, utterly personal stuff, and they are in Victoria's hand. That was the moment that Riddle finally knew that the family archive was real, and she knew that she had to press further. On tracking down John Brown's descendants, she of course discovered that indeed they held more, though the collection was no longer whole, because from the 1950s onwards, parts of it had been donated, other parts of it had been sold at auction, and what survived was scattered and very fragmented, and her task became one of piecing together this amazing puzzle. And then came one of the most extraordinary finds of all, the work of historian Fenton Wyness. In the 1950s, he had actually met the Brown family and photographed absolutely everything, every letter, every artifact, every scrap of jewelry and memento that Victoria had given John. The entire collection captured in a single set of images before it was broken apart. And when Riddle saw these photographs alongside auction catalogues and museum pieces that had emerged in the decades since, the picture was absolutely undeniable. The relationship between Queen Victoria and John Brown was not friendship in the ordinary sense. It was profound, it was intimate, and it was sustained. And the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Of course, some argue otherwise. They suggest that the Victorians expressed themselves in very melodramatic tones, and of course they do, and that grief and love and loss were wrapped in extravagant language, that Victoria's words were no more than florid conversations of her age. And look, yes, the Victorians were romantic and they were prone to sentiment, but they were also incredibly precise, contextual people. Romantic platonic love certainly existed between friends, between same-sex companions, even in familial bonds. Yet the words Victoria used for John Brown, the insistence that no one loves you more than I do, it cannot be dismissed as platonic conversation. In the context of her life, her grief, her devotion, I think it speaks of something much, much greater. There's a temptation, I think also when looking back at Victoria's love letters, to soften them, to explain them away as florid expressions of the age. A woman calling another woman beloved, a man declaring eternal devotion to his male friend. There's a very familiar pattern. And very often in LGBTQ histories, that ambiguity becomes a battleground. Were these real relationships or merely romantic friendships dressed in purple prose? But that simply doesn't work here. These are not letters between two women or between two men or even between equals. They are the words of a widowed queen, still shrouded in black, writing to an unmarried servant, a crofter's son, in terms of beloved John, dear, dear John, darling John. Words that she actually reserved only for Albert and for her children. And I think to dismiss that as platonic is to abandon, common sense. The language is way too intimate, it's way too scandalous, and it's too shocking for the time. And I think what's interesting is that the survival of John's own voice is very thin. His personal archive was deliberately destroyed by Victoria's court after his death, and it still lingers in the words that she recorded. He told her, she wrote, that he would die for her. No one loved her more than he did. I'm convinced of it. Those are not the words of a mere servant. They are the declarations of a man absolutely in love. I think it's also striking, too, that what he didn't do, he never angled for a peerage, he never reached for honours, he never demanded land or wealth. He didn't want anything from her at all apart from her company. Victoria herself says it again and again. He wants nothing more. And I think that's why I find the comparison some make to the Rasputin affair, kind of laughable. John Brown was no manipulator. He was blunt, he was loyal, he was stubborn. He was a man who had stumbled into the Queen's life and across an impossible class divide found himself loved by her, and in return, loving her very much. For 20 years, they guarded each other fiercely against gossip, against scandal, against the world. But then, of course, we come to the most dangerous question of all. Were they secretly married? And this gives me goosebumps, I have to tell you, because there is evidence, strange, half-buried evidence that points in that direction. And I think it's been brushed aside for far too long. One discovery in particular has haunted me. The deathbed confession of Victoria's Scottish chaplain, who admitted that he had married the Queen to John Brown.
And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back.
For years, historians treated it as a curiosity, if you like, a faint rumor best swept quietly, under the rug. But why? Why dismiss it so quickly, so lightly, when its implications are actually so extraordinary? I went back to that confession and re-examined it in its proper context and placed it against the backdrop of 1872, the very period when I believe a marriage did take place. And the more that Riddle studied it, the more documentation I saw, the harder it became to ignore. And one thing struck me as I dug deeper, something most historians of Victoria seem to have overlooked. We've always asked the marriage question through an English lens. Could they have wed secretly in England? Surely not, we say. There would have been banns, a church record, a witness. How could it possibly have been hidden for so long? But I think that's the wrong frame entirely to view this, because in Scotland, where John came from, marriage law was very, very different. And what was common in his own Aberdeenshire community at the time was the practice of irregular marriage. And irregular marriage was perfectly legal under Scottish law. It didn't need a church or an official registry. It didn't require banns. It could be as simple as two people exchanging vows before a respected witness, a clergyman, or even a notable from the parish. Sometimes rings were exchanged. Sometimes it was written down. But the essence, I think, was actually quite simple. And if you and your partner declared yourselves married, then you were married, in the eyes of God and the law. Seen through that lens, the old rumours look very different, don't they? The deathbed confession of Norman MacLeod, Victoria's Scottish chaplain, it suddenly takes on a new weight. He claimed that he had married Victoria and John. He said this just before he died, and historians have tended to brush it aside as fanciful. But how strange is it that when you stop to think about it, a man of the cloth, one of the most influential chaplains in Scotland, absolving his soul before he dies. So why should we dismiss it so casually? To ignore a sacred deathbed confession simply because it's inconvenient. And that seems to me willful blindness. So Riddle set out to test it, and when she placed MacLeod's words alongside the broader context, what emerged was absolutely fascinating. By the 1870s, John and Victoria's relationship had deepened. They had declared their love, they had endured years of whispered scandal, and then came a turning point. Victoria survived an assassination attempt. John Brown was the man who saved her, physically tackling the would-be killer to the ground. And of course, in the aftermath of that, everything shifted. Suddenly, Victoria's behavior towards John hardened into ritual and recognition. She ordered her sons to shake his hand whenever he entered their presence. I mean, that's a remarkable command in a court that's obsessed with hierarchy. And from 1873 onwards, on the little finger of his left hand, John started to wear a solid gold signet ring. And that matters because in European custom, especially in so-called morganatic marriages, the hidden, unequal unions of royal commoners, such matches were actually known as left-handed marriages. And here, suddenly, on John's left hand, a solid gold signet ring that never ever left him. He never took it off. And this sounds a little bit like, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, I know. But then, as I sat with Fenton Winus's archive, turning page after page of his photographs of the Brown family collection, I found something that actually stopped me cold. And I imagine with the Riddle it was exactly the same way. After John's death, Victoria actually had his hand cast in plaster. She did the same for Albert, and it was an act of mourning, of memory, of devotion. And on the plaster cast, there it is, the signet ring preserved forever on his little finger. And of course, then there was the final heartbreaking detail. When Victoria herself died, she was laid to rest wearing John Brown's mother's wedding ring. And that image alone, folks, is devastating to the rumors. The widowed Queen of England, Empress of India, carried into eternity not only Albert's relics alone, but the ring of her servant's mother. Why would she take such a risk? Why would she defy every expectation, every scandal, every plea from her children, her ministers, and her court? The answer, I think, lies in her character. The Victoria I found while writing and researching this podcast is not the prudish widow of popular imagination. She was passionate. She was tempestuous. She was definitely headstrong. She ignored every demand to cast John aside. And again, her ministers begged her. Her family pleaded with her to do so. And again, she answered with same stubborn refusal. John stays. He will not be parted from me. And when she said it with the force of a woman in love. And I think for me, that's why the marriage question can't be dismissed. It fits her character, her defiance, her words. And I think it also explains the clues, the confession, the ring, the mourning rituals, and the final act of devotion at death. And that, I think, is the heart of it, really. Why would Victoria take such a risk? Why would a monarch so devoted to tradition, to the dignity of the crown, to being the best queen she could be, entangle herself so completely with a Highland servant? And the explanation, I don't think it's complicated, folks. She was in love. And when you look at her behavior through that lens, everything falls into place. So Riddle worked through her research for 2 years, and she kept circling back to the same question. Why would she do this? What could possibly explain it? Why does it make no sense? And of course, then came the turning point. Once Riddle understood the practice of irregular marriage in Scotland, once she'd pieced together the testimonies, the letters, the rituals, it was like a veil lifting. If they were married, and Riddle believes they were, I also believe they were, then nothing about Victoria's behavior seems completely odd. It becomes logical, coherent, entirely human. Her insistence that her sons shake John's hand, even throwing Bertie out of the room when he refused. It suddenly makes sense, doesn't it? They weren't petty whims. They were political acts. John wasn't just a servant. He was being positioned, in Victoria's eyes, as a de facto consort, a man who should be showed respect as her partner. And I think that's what makes this and makes her so fascinating. The most traditional of monarchs, but also the most passionate, the most willful, and the most defiant of women. But then we come to the most explosive rumor of all, the idea that there may have been a child. You know, stories of such children have swirled for decades. Tales of hidden documents, family histories, hints in letters, but they're always elusive, always just beyond reach. And for months, Riddles chased those rumors, and every trail that she went down ended in disappointment. You know, letters supposedly at Cootes Bank, inaccessible. Claims of descendants that led nowhere, hints in auction catalogues, gossip in old biographies, but never anything solid. And then at last, she came to the realization, she told herself, perhaps this really is just that. You know, it's gossip. Perhaps, although she had proved their love, even their marriage, but maybe the child was nothing more than just a story. She would write it off as unsubstantiated. A curiosity, I suppose, rather than a fact. But then one night, speaking to John Brown's surviving descendants in Minnesota, everything changed in her world. She says they were talking through some of the artifacts that they had kept, passing over the usual ground, when she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had found nothing credible to support the idea of a secret child. She said it was very late, she was very tired, and she said it, and then said, thought best left as a rumor. And then Angela, one of John's descendants, listened quietly. She cocked an eyebrow. Well, that's fascinating, she said. Half asleep, Riddle almost missed it. She asked back, why fascinating? And then came the words that absolutely floored her. Angela said, because that's what we were always told, that there was a baby given to the family. There was a long boat ride, and that baby is who we are all descended from. The child of John Brown and Queen Victoria. We were always told they were in love. We were always told it was more than friendship. We were told they were married. And we were told they had a child. Riddle must have fallen off the sofa at that news, you know, both literally and metaphorically, because here suddenly was not a historian's hunch or an academic speculation, but living family memory, a testimony handed down across generations. Of course, family stories are very tricky. Time distorts, truth slips into myth. You know, a tale told often enough hardens into tradition and even truth, even when the facts behind it are a little bit blurred. And I have to say, as a historian, reading this, I knew I had to treat it with care. And I think the question is not whether they believed it, because they clearly did. The question is whether there is evidence to support it. Could this family tradition contain a kernel of truth? Could there really have been a child? And for Riddle, that's where her investigation turned next. Hugh, John's brother, isn't who Angela is descended from. He and his wife Jessie had actually gone to New Zealand. Now, of course, Riddle had to be cautious, but what fascinated her as she dug further was how the evidence, once scattered, began to line up in very intriguing ways. And we're not talking about a modern period of small families, you know, of 2 children and a dog. You know, Victorians lived in a very different world. You know, fertility was higher. Families had 5, 7, 11, 9 children. And so when you begin to see patterns and correlations, you know, your curiosity can't but be piqued. And I think what made Riddle stop was that in 1869, Victoria's son, Alfred, or Alfie, went on a royal tour to New Zealand. And while he was there, he actually sought out John Brown's brother, Hugh. Now, you have to ask yourself, why on earth would a royal prince, half a world away, seek out the brother of his mother's servant? It's a really bizarre connection, and yet there it is, another piece in the puzzle. And for Riddle, then came something even stranger. Among the Brown family papers in Aberdeen, she found a letter from Victoria to John. One of those extraordinary letters where she calls him Darling One. And in it, she is begging him to bring Hugh and his family home. She offers to pay every expense. She wants them back in Britain. She wants them settled and she wants them secure. So you have to ask yourself why. Why would this family above all others matter so much to her? And then, of course, there was the house. Victoria actually built John a mansion on the Balmoral estate. And in the letters never seen before, which Riddle had uncovered in her research, she made clear that the house and its land were to belong to John and his brothers for generations forever. It was to be theirs, in effect, in perpetuity. Now, John had many brothers, many nieces and nephews, and Victoria was close to several of them. But then you have to look at who was chosen to live in the great house. Only Hugh. Only Hugh, his wife Jessie, and their daughter Marianne. No one else. Not the larger families with 5 or 9 children. Just this one family with one child. When John died, it was Hugh, Jessie, and Marianne that Victoria scooped up from Balmoral and actually carried down to Windsor. And while we know Victoria publicly doted on John's other nieces, 2 of them were actually named after her. And Victoria Brown, who actually appeared in the press, was actually gifted a wedding dress and jewels by the Queen. Marianne is never mentioned. Not once. There's no press reports. There's no records. And yet she was the one that Victoria kept the closest. And I think, as a historian, that silence is absolutely deafening. Of course, without DNA, we can never answer this question definitively. There's no accessible royal DNA to test against. Angela, John's descendant in Minnesota, she was actually wonderfully level-headed about it. And Riddle said that they told her, this is what we have always been told. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, but this is our story and we believe it. And I think that in itself is incredibly powerful. A family memory preserved across generations, holding on to a secret love affair that official histories have actually denied. And I find that fascinating because there must be space, even in history, for ambiguity, for stories that breathe, for mysteries that remain long beyond our grasp. And right now, we are in that in-between place. The evidence is absolutely tantalizing, it's suggestive, and in some cases, it's astonishing. But can we ever prove it? Could DNA one day actually provide an answer? Possibly. The problem is that lineage has broken down in the family line. Marianne had a son, Hugh, who was Angela's grandfather, and once the line goes male, mitochondrial DNA is lost. So we're waiting, really, for the science to catch up, because in years to come, new methods will allow us to test what we can't test for today. But whether or not there's a child, it doesn't alter the core truth that Victoria and John loved each other. They guarded each other. They likely married. And that alone, I think, is enough to transform how we see the Queen. And if one day we discover there was also a child, it doesn't change the love story, does it? It only shows us its boundaries. And yet so much of the story has been lost, hidden, or, quietly suppressed. And that perhaps, I think, is the most revealing detail of all. And I think that story really begins at John's death, with Victoria building him this beautiful mansion, a mansion on the Balmoral estate that she loves so much, intended as his forever family home. I've seen the letters that Riddle found, the ones that had never before been published, proving that she really wanted it secured for him and his brothers. And yet when I examined John's estate inventory, there is no will, and there's no mention of the house. And that makes me suspicious, to say the least. I know the house existed. It was spoken of in documents as his. Why then is it missing from the record? And then I found something even more extraordinary. Victoria wanted to write a book about John. We know she published Leaves from the Highlands, and later more Leaves from the Highlands. But after John's death, she wanted to go further, to actually tell his story, to tell their story, using his diary entries as her own. And she was absolutely furious when a review dismissed John as nothing more than a dependable servant. And she actually wrote to her secretary, Henry Ponsonby, that she wanted to show he was much, much more, that she wanted the truth to be known. But John's death actually stripped her of her protector at court. And in the aftermath of his death, the campaign of suppression began. Ministers, secretaries, even the Archbishop of Canterbury all warned her off. Ponsonby, Randall Davidson, and others all made it their mission to ensure nothing was ever published. They wrote memoranda describing her words for John as dangerous, as compromising, that his letters and his diary should never be shown. And then, of course, her children joined in. Bertie, the future Edward VII, set about erasing and banning as much as he could. Beatrice, ever the dutiful daughter, edited her mother's journals, cutting out entire sections, effectively erasing John and his family from the record wherever possible. But thankfully, they didn't succeed completely because fragments survived. Letters, family testimony, private collections, photographs, even casts of John's hand, pieces scattered across the country and across the world. But when you bring them all together, the picture's overwhelming. What emerges is not the Victoria of cliché, the prudish widow who wore black for half a century, endlessly mourning Albert. No. What we see is a woman of passion, a woman who loved again and loved fiercely, defiantly, against every obstacle. A woman who declared of John Brown, "I am his only subject." And that's underlined in her own hand. For 20 years, he was the center of her world, and she was the center of his. And that, to me, folks, is incredibly powerful because it restores something that has been taken away. It restores John Brown and his family to the place in history that I think they deserve. And I think it also restores Victoria herself, not as the marble widow of myth, but as a woman of flesh and blood who's capable of love and risk and desire. And that's the story that I hope people will carry away. Folks, thanks for listening in. Again, apologies about my voice, but it's a story that I think, even with my voice the way it is, it's worthwhile hearing. It's worthwhile thinking about. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.